Good morning, and welcome to day 112 of F260 at First Baptist Meridian. Today we look at Isaiah chapters 44 and 45. And as we said yesterday, the book of Isaiah breaks down into three major sections, chapters 1 through 39, which are set with the Assyrian Empire as the background, chapters 40 through 55, which are set primarily with the Babylonian Empire as the background, and then chapters 56 through 66, which are set with Persia as the primary background. So in chapters 40 through 55, the people have come under judgment, thematically in the language of the book. It envisions a time when Israel is in exile, but God promises them that his judgment, their exile, is not the final chapter of this story. And so he reminds them of two things. One, that he is God, that no one knows the future as he does. And so just as they didn't need to worship false gods when they were in the land, doubly so, they don't need to succumb to the worship of false gods now that many of them are out of the land. The text uses multiple images for this. It says, a guy takes a tree, cuts it down, he makes half of it into an idol, and then uses half of it for a fire to cook his food, and then worships the thing that he's consumed as though it's a god, or a different part of the thing that he's consumed as though it's a god. Just by way of reminder, the Babylonians overthrew historically the southern kingdom in 587, but even before that they began deporting some of the best and brightest out of Judea. Sometime between 609 and 605 you had a second wave of deportees in 597, including the prophet Ezekiel, as we've mentioned, and then when the temple and palace were destroyed with Jerusalem in 587, you have a third round or third wave of deportees. And so one of the biggest crises of the Old Testament is once God's people are out of the land, they're cut off from their place, they're cut off from their worship, they're cut off from so much, their identity. Is God done with us? Have we done irrevocable damage to the covenant and his purposes and his promises? And this middle section of Isaiah says that's not the case at all. In fact, starting with chapter 40, you have the language that God is going to do a new exodus. The second section starts off with, "Comfort my people, comfort." That God is going to use even the unfathomably bad to achieve the unfathomably good. And God often works in surprising ways. And so one of the things that we find in today's reading is that one of the things that God will use, just as he used foreign kings to discipline his people, he will use foreign kings to deliver his people. God wants to show them precisely that when they are among the nations, that he has control over the nations. He says, your Babylonian overlords will not remain so indefinitely. He's raising up Cyrus, who is a Persian. And Cyrus will ultimately overthrow the Babylonians in 539, 538 BC. And 70 years after the first wave of deportees, the people get to come home or begin coming home. So 50 years after the third major wave. 70 years after the temple is destroyed in 587. It's rebuilt and rededicated around 516 BC. So you see that God is using judgment, even his judgment, redemptively. And this passage reminds them, I'm in control, I have a plan, I have a purpose, but I might work in some ways you might not expect. And the interesting thing for me is God's use of Cyrus. You'll have direct messianic language associated with Cyrus because some of this is foreshadowing what God will ultimately do in Jesus. But I thought about how often does God use someone who is at least partially an outside to deliver people who can't see his plans fully from the inside. So like that, think back to the Exodus itself. Think back to Abraham. Abraham left an identity before he could lead in a mission. Moses was a Hebrew, yes, but how was he raised? As an Egyptian. And he left an identity. He was in the wilderness before he could lead a mission. Jesus is sent as the Messiah, but he doesn't come in kingly majesty, right? He comes as the son of a humble mason, Joseph. And before he begins his mission, he leaves. He goes into the wilderness. So God is always the God who knows how to lead his people. And God knows what needs to happen on the inside, and God's able and willing to work from the outside. That does not make Cyrus, by the way, a perfect king or a fully just man, but it does point the way forward to how God works so that we can appreciate the perfect ruler, the perfect king, the fully just and righteous one, Jesus Christ, who ultimately leads us out of slavery, out of bondage, out of exile, out of sin, and into the presence of God himself. Read these chapters, pick up on some of the imagery, keep reading, reflecting, and responding, and I'll see you tomorrow. God bless.